From blueprints to booming businesses, from groundbreaking to grand openings, this is Beyond the Blueprint. Join host Brad Howard as he takes you behind the scenes of growth and development in Mooresville, Lake Norman, and beyond. We're talking with the decision makers, the planners, the visionaries shaping our communities, giving exclusive insight into what happens before, during, and after projects that define our region. The future is being built right now. Let's go beyond the blueprint.
Good afternoon. Thank you to those tuning in on the radio on 105.9 FM, 100.7 FM, 1400 AM, on social media, on WSICnews.com, and on demand with the WSIC News app. I'm your host, Brad Howard, and joining us today are Senator, the Honorable, Your Excellency, Andrew Brock, and David Jerome. Senator Brock served 17 years in the North Carolina Senate, is past chairman of IT, Energy, Natural, and Economic Resources for the state. And David is the executive director of the Institute of Digital Engineering, focusing on aerospace and defense. And today's show goes beyond the blueprint in an open conversation on how technology and innovation are poised to drive a new economy and the potential that it will create for our region. So with that, I know you guys. Let's talk about Andrew. So Senator Brock, tell us, who are you and how did you get here?
Got here, was born and raised in Davie County. My family's lived in this region for actually about 10 generations. The first mill brought to the South was through my family, the Shink Mill over in Lincoln County. So we've always been really interested in production and commerce. So from that time on, my family's worked in farming, agriculture, but in the same way, also looking at engineering. And, one reason why this area was so industrious in that time was the, harnessing energy off the Catawba River. Mm-hmm. And that, that being a point is, one of the reasons why we're here today is what do we do with that power and how do we best use it for our citizens? And so that's, that always kind of was part of my background in the legislature. And in fact, first day I was sworn in the office, I called then Duke Energy and John McAllister, who worked for Duke, and said, how can we get some more facilities in the, in this region for producing power? We got McGuire, we got Marshall, but also there's areas over in Davie County that would have been a new site for a new nuclear facility that was actually talked about in the year I was born in 1974.
1974.
So it's been 51 years and it's still not built, but there's daylight to waste and we need to get to it.
All right, very good. And David?
Well, I've been here, I think, about 6 months now at this point, maybe just a month longer, 7 in that ballpark. But my wife is from Virginia. I was originally from New York. We've lived and worked all over the place, as we were discussing. I mean, I've had the great good fortune to work in Asia, Europe, the United States, places like that, but in a lot of different jobs too. I mean, corporate staff jobs and operational jobs and things of that sort. So it's been really sort of fun, but we just moved here from Texas, my wife and I have to tell you, it's really nice to be back east because it feels like home. And you recognize the trees, it rains, you're okay with it. It's just, we're just loving it. I remember when we were driving from Charlotte Airport into Mooresville for the first time, and we're coming across that causeway, and I'm like, oh man, this is beautiful. I mean, it really is heaven on earth. So we're having a lot of fun here.
Very good. So we're going to talk about technology and how it impacts things. And I think both of you have very diverse backgrounds in those fields. David, tell us about the Institute.
Yeah, I think the thing that's important maybe to sort of set the table for a conversation like this generally is why would we
why
having it?
Why are we having this conversation?
At some levels, I think for us at the Institute of Digital Engineering, It's about a 3.5-year-old organization. It was a brainchild of some really bright folks at Corvid Industries, which is in Mooresville already. So, in some ways, I'm quite lucky. I get to stand on the shoulders of the giants that went before me. But I will say what's interesting about it, I think for us, as we sort of get introduced to why this matters and why I think about it, is maybe talk about some trends, because although trends aren't everything, it gives you a sense whether you're swimming upstream or with the current, and one's a lot easier than the other.
Absolutely.
and technology has a lot of that sort of characteristic, I think, as we talk about it. So a couple of maybe things to think about, or at least for us to comment on, all of us, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I mean, one thing would be, we were sort of chatting earlier, just getting introduced, and the fact that the United States is no longer the arsenal of democracy that it once was. And when we look at potential conflicts around the world, they are not getting less.
Right.
They are, in the uncertainty
Rapidly
around them
increasing.
is escalating. So that is an issue. And so when we look at manufacturing and our ability to sustain what we call a near peer conflict, so China, for example, Russia or something like that, not a small country that would be easy in a sense for us to militarily dominate, but one that would be much harder. The situation in that circumstance is, they're never easy. I don't mean it that way, but just necessarily it would cost less and maybe go faster. But in the context of China, that's clearly not going to happen, or it's going to be a fight. And if that's the case, one of the things you have to be concerned about is the ability to sustain it. If you don't have the manufacturing wherewithal to do that, that's a problem.
Right.
And so right now, China is about 30% of the global manufacturing footprint, the United States 17%, and then the rest of the world after that.
And the rest of the world follows. Right.
And so the fact is, what are we going to do to encourage manufacturing to grow again in the United States appropriately? We may not want all manufacturing, but certain kinds we find very important. And this was highlighted during, the latest pandemic we just went through with COVID. Where were the face masks?
Right. They were in China.
Yeah. That's where they were made, and they needed them there. So contract or not, that's where they stayed. So in other words, what are we going to do, and how do we think about that? Some other things that I think are important for us to think about that pertain to this kind of a problem, in technology just generally, is, the workforce. Where is it going to come from?
Where is it going to come from?
So we'll talk about that, but that's a big issue. And so North Carolina is blessed with some really, truly outstanding educational institutions, and they have several R1 research institutions here. Mm-hmm. So this is a big advantage. How do we get them involved, and how do we, turn out more engineers that have a place to stay and work?
Right. How do we leverage all the local assets that we already have without having to go out and recruit?
Right. Or at least tweak, how do we grow them appropriately? And I'd say maybe another one to think about, just generally speaking, is policy overall in the environment that we have to operate in. When we lived and worked in places like California, it would take maybe 7 years to get a building constructed.
If you could do it in 7 years.
If you could do it in 7 years. That lack of, let's say, speed has a lot of impact in this day and age, when everything is moving much quicker than we even realize. So if you can't bring velocity to the table with a certain amount of policy and business friendliness, you lose. Because if I'm a business and I'm thinking about, let's say, starting or growing here, and I can't find employees and I can't get something done in under 7 years,
maybe California is not the right place for you to be.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
Maybe you look to North Carolina. Maybe come to Mooresville.
Well, that's what we're hoping. And so there's a lot of advantages we have. And I think the one thing, though, that I would say for people that are listening.
And we're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back.
That's the teaser. Yeah.
And we're back, and we're going to learn from David what that one thing was that we got cut off right before the break.
I don't think it could have gone better, right, in that regard. But I do. The thing that I think is important as we also look at these trends is that the things like venture capital, the private money that gets involved in the marketplace, 80% of that goes in 3 places in the United States. So development's not equal among communities, right? It goes different places. So if you're not Boston, New York, or California, where 80% of the venture capital goes, that means you're fighting with
For
Texas and every other place for the rest of it, which is, let's say 20%. And so it's a real battle. Money moves around. And I think that if you want to make sure that you can leverage it as you try to grow your technology and your interests, do understand that it's a competitive world out there for those things. And we have to make sure we are friendly. We are aware of the trends. And I'd say the thing that's most interesting about the IDE, the organization I run, it's a network of people that collaborate, really deep thinkers in terms of understanding the technologies that are involved. But it's the collaboration, the group working together that I think really is effective.
That's good. Everybody in the room talking, coming up with ideas, sharing, and trying to make the community a better place.
That's right.
And technology is amazing. And I won't deviate here because I want to get Andrew's perspective, but we'll have a tangent on AI in the next little bit here. But Andrew, what kind of perspective do you have on that?
Well, I think, looking at how can the state or how can local entities pivot into the new fields. And I was elected in 2002. And, family, this whole area was based on textiles, tobacco, and furniture. Those were gone. And how can the state, pivot? And, we were looking like, how do we get our, jobs at the factories? And we had some really good jobs that paid really well for so long, but were we sharpening the saw? When there's a rainy day, there's always, growing up in agriculture, there's never a day off. If it's a rainy day, you don't get to stay inside and watch soap operas. You sharpen the saw, you work on the tools, you sharpen the blades, you work on the equipment that you can in the barn or in the shed because, sunny days are coming. So you've got to be ready. You've got to be able to pivot. We're a basketball area. You got to learn, how you drop that pivot step. But, looking at that, where do we look at engineering? Where do we look at that next step? It was brought up this past weekend. I went to school at Western Carolina. We were one of the first schools, actually the first state-supported school that had internet access in every room. And, it sounds like, back in my day, this is, but the reason why I sold it, because there was all the student body presidents all the student body presidents were in front of the Board of Governors in North Carolina. There was a really bad article about them in the News and Observer, the newspaper in Raleigh. And I took that article and wrapped it around my physics book. I had it with me. I had a test coming up, so I was studying on the way down to Chapel Hill. And I threw the book on the table in front of the powers that be of North Carolina education. I said it would take 3 days for that newspaper to get to Cullowhee. And there was an article that was, pretty damning of all the people in that room. And I said, we cannot compete that way. In my international economic class, we have 3 Americans. Today, they're my classmates. Tomorrow, they're my competition. All the other student body presidents were talking about multiculturalism and diversity. And I said, that's all well and good. But, we have to compete. We're not getting a degree to go out there and hold hands with all of our competitors. We're there to win. We're there to make business. We're there to make better business decisions than they are to compete. And, we need to have internet access, because if we're going to be in a remote location, if we're going to be in a different location, or even if we're in a prime location, we have to have that ability, that tool in our system to make sure that we win. And what was interesting, on the way home, the chancellor kept calling me every hour on the hour to give him a call, because whatever you said has gotten people really upset in Chapel Hill. I stopped by, home there in Mooresville, and my dad asked me how the meeting went, and I told him, and he said, son, I think you stepped on their toes. I said, well, Dad, maybe they'll stand up and do something about it.
So what did they do? They
came up the very next day, and we became the first school, and in great thanks go to Congressman Charles Taylor in the mountains. He was fantastic representative up there as far as reaching out into Western North Carolina, helping us move forward, getting things that we need in technology, and help start the engineering school up there, the construction management. We were seen as a teachers college, and we were a great teachers program up there. But he also saw we need more engineers in the state. And so, Congressman Taylor, he was a driving force behind that, both in technology and engineering for Western North Carolina. And, of course, those guys go across the state now.
Right. And on that same point, it goes back to what you just said about Wi-Fi, having the first Wi-Fi in the state.
It was internet access.
Just internet access.
Just internet access. Oh yeah, we had a.
Yeah. So Gen Z, they don't know the world before the internet. We know the world before the internet, just how fast things change. And if we're not on top of it and being proactive in adopting these new technologies and these new, I guess, looking at business opportunities that are out there, we're going to be left behind, just like you were talking about. So on that point, what do we do about infrastructure? I mean, you just got me to think about that. There was no internet until when mass on the mass scale was what, the early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And then, from that point, what was Amazon? What was, people just had an idea about it, but the world functions on that. And I think AI is taking that next step. And most people still think that AI is a toy. But what it's done, I've really opened my mind with what it can do as far as uploading documents, uploading blueprints, plans, everything else. It can find the details. It is amazing how much time it can save. And as the world becomes faster, there's going to be more need and more demand for that. So how do we be proactive in working and embracing that need?
I think part of it is, we know the barriers there. People are looking at, well, I don't know how to code. I don't know how to, I don't understand different computer languages. Now with speaking to AI, you can just speak in broken English and it will go and determine what you're trying to get at, what you're trying to solve, or what problem you're trying to work on. And once you get past that initial wall that you can't get through, it's like people running the 4-minute mile. It seemed impossible. There's studies saying, "Oh no, humans can't run that fast." And we have one here in Jim Beatty was the first American to break the 4-minute indoor mile. When people start breaking that, then it's just floodgates open that people can go, well, I can do that. I can get through that next point. So that's looking at when you're looking at the limitations set by, people or institutions saying we can't get through them. We can get there. We can, the big picture is that, individuals, here in North Carolina or anywhere else in the country, we can get there. You look at our competitors like China. I've said earlier that, with my brother was at one time, a very advanced CNC operator, one of 3 people in the world. I said, man, brother, that's pretty good. It means there's 1,000 people, 1 in a million. And there's 1,000 people just like you in China. That saying, when in a war of attrition, they just have more people, more advanced and more things that they can do. Plus, when you're looking at that type of competition, we have to be better. As my old coach told me, he said, you got to play better than the worst referee. So, be better than yourself, be better than your opponent, be better than someone trying to help your opponent.
Very good. So how do we speed things up? How do we embrace this technology and the day-to-day opportunities that we discussed earlier about bringing things to market faster so we can have that competitive advantage against our competitors abroad?
Well, I think we know intuitively that the systems and processes we put in place to be dominant during the Industrial Revolution have to be revisited and thought about now in terms of an information economy. And so, and a digital economy and things of this sort. So, I'm very fond of that Steve Jobs speech, that he gave at Stanford when he said, do what you love, pursue your passion. And, it put me in a funny position because I don't ever really think of myself ever in opposition to anything Steve Jobs would ever say. But one thing I would maybe add to it is that I think it's also good, though, to know your talent and what you're good at. And if people are willing to pay you for it, pursue it. And what I'm really trying to say in the long term here is be agile, be curious, and do things that you know are going to matter to your life, not just your passion in a sense. You have to do things that make a difference. And I do think, looking at STEM and math and science, and these are not magic, they're real, they make a difference. These are important things to pursue. And I think businesses should be involved with governments and partnerships to work on this, not in isolation with each other. Communities should do this together.
Because when people are together and they talk,
right.
Good things come out of it.
It's funny. The older I get, I started as a lawyer a long time ago. And then, as over time, I switched into business. And so 2 careers. Now I'm dealing with engineering quite a bit, which is quite funny to me. And the more I learn about it, the more I see, I'm thinking, why didn't I pay more attention in math class? I'm like, but I mean, it's this stuff is not as staid and boring as I thought it was when I was younger. I think we have an obligation to teach it well, to make sure that people understand how important it is to their lives and where we're going. And it's not just being good at math and engineering. I think just being agile, being willing to shift and remain curious. I know these sounds like platitudes, but they're really not, and they make a difference. And a lot of the best engineers I work with are very curious people. They want to know how stuff works, how to fix things.
How to fix it. And we're going to come right back, and we're going to have the next discussion on some local impact with this trend. We'll be right back. And we're back, and we're going to take the next step here and talk about something local to home that's been in the news, is the Mooresville Technology Park. So more of a practical local topic to dig into. Good, bad, and different. We have, I think there's a need to embrace this and have a good conversation, because when a business looks to expand, they don't, let's take the Mooresville Industrial Park, for example. So if somebody didn't come in and put that park there, and when the company was prepared to move, then the park and the infrastructure and everything is there ready for them to advance forward. The digital world is the same way. And there's other places, there's other states they can go to. So the conversation needs to be around, this park, good, bad, and different. What are your thoughts, Andrew?
I think it's a great idea to, forward think about where you want to be as an economy, where do you want to be as as a focus of what you want to do to bring jobs into the area. Like I said, my family's been here 10 generations. We've been here, and we've seen from horse and cart to raw horsepower of Race City, USA. And what do you do to prepare yourself for this area? And see, that's one thing about it, is that one thing great about North Carolina is that we have low energy cost, and it goes back. I mean, I've always been taught this. I even wrote a paper in college that economic development follows. I said cheap energy in college, and the energy people don't like it. So low cost energy. So, but economic development follows, because if you're able to produce at a lower cost, it's going to be beneficial. Now you're looking at, data centers and bringing in, companies and everything else. If they know we can have it, here at lower overhead cost, it's going to be greatly benefit us. Plus, as an auxiliary, that, surrounding companies, surrounding residents, knowing that if we have this dedicated, entity here for a company, that for us to have power backup, energy backup, everything else that we need is such a vital part of our economy now, that it's better for us with the storm, because, you've got to get it back up and running. It's got to stay on 24/7. And North Carolina is like the premier place to have data centers in the country. The low propensity of earthquakes, right. Our ability to have, low cost energy, our location. I mean, we're in the greatest location in the United States, halfway up and down the East Coast. So, we're in a great place for it. And if we can use this option for data centers or any type of expansion in engineering and government, it also brings lots of jobs in, and the cost of the living will be mitigated by we've got a red hot economy. Right. You have to remember, we're not that far And we're not that far in distance nor in time when Pilatex closed its doors in Kannapolis.
Or Burlington and Mooresville.
And the largest, this area, not so much the lake area, but just 10 miles away from here. It was part of my Senate district. I led the nation in job losses in the United States of textiles and manufacturing. And to see an area that was a textbook, and I mean textbook, economically depressed area, and to see us embrace the research campus over in Kannapolis, and the founder of that, David Murdoch, who just recently passed away at 102 years old, to see him to create a phoenix out of the ashes. It was actually named Phoenix Project, of looking at how do we use engineering, how do we use science to look at food. We all eat it. Right. And how do we make food better? How do we make agriculture better? Because it's not just here, but all over the world. And his impact in agriculture is felt in everything he touched with, he was a great person, did a lot of great things. And, how do we find that, new economy, but how do we benefit everybody? And, as we embrace energy, as we embrace technology, as we embrace agriculture in this area, it's a good thing for us.
Right. And that specific example is what we were talking about earlier with, it was a collaboration. It was the government, it was the private sector, it was the educational sector, all coming together to create and pivot, in your words, and create a new basically redevelop Kannapolis into what you see today.
Yeah. I mean, when you go from a mill where the employees, and it was a good job, but when they closed their doors, we had to teach older workers there how to read, how to go back and basically learn again. And the longer people were away from working in a job, the tougher it was to get them back in shape. We saw that with COVID, with people who were not working, that when they started working again, it was terrible. Or at the actually furniture plant in Davie County, which is now the largest furniture plant in the world. Here was a furniture company that said, hey, I can put a furniture plant right in the heart of furniture manufacturing in the world. This will be great. These people are out of work. And to be honest, they were so rusty that when we first opened, it took a while to shake off that rust. And now, but they kept expanding it and growing larger and larger because we were able to do that. But also, how do you use innovation in manufacturing to make a product that we do, really well, create a product, but how do we use that to be better? And it's always sharpening the saw. How do you make yourself better? How do you look at, one of my favorite things in manufacturing was we had a plant that was about to close down in Davie County that made doors. And the plant manager was a fantastic guy. His name was Don Yeager, Chuck Yeager's cousin. He listened to his employees. And one of his employees said, my back wouldn't hurt as much if we can just turn this assembly line on its side. So instead of reaching across, I can just use the rivets and make everything in. And he's like, hey, let's do that. And production increased 25% almost overnight. And actually, they closed other facilities across the country and moved operations here. So it created, I think, 200 jobs. But I mean, it was just simple innovation.
Well, I think if I remember the question about the industrial park,
yes,
and how we're looking at that. No, because I was enthralled. You just have to mention Chuck Yeager, and I'm already. He's a fantastic individual and a great, I think, source of inspiration for us as we think about some of these things. I'm everything about him impressive, and it's so easy to be afraid of change and the rate of it. If you're not concerned about it, but I mean, then on the other hand, what doesn't change? Everything does, and you must be part of it. The question is, how do you do that, and how do you get comfortable with it? And I think at some levels, I can understand, something like this showing up in my backyard or whatever could be disconcerting if you don't have the facts. So get educated, get the facts, and you'll become much less concerned. But I think on the other hand, too, and I do think that's important, and we should help people that are having a hard time with change, whether it's a career change as a result of IT, or, my neighborhood might be different a little bit,
Right.
or maybe it won't be. And I just think it will be, but could somebody explain that to me?
Right.
You have to be open to that discussion, but you also have to want it in a sense, right? So I think on the other side, though, I would say that, I work for the Institute of Digital Engineering, so it's pretty obvious how I feel about digital infrastructure. It's sort of like having struck oil in your backyard.
Mhm.
You probably want to put a well on it and tap it. So the fact that something like that's happening is a huge, in my opinion, a wealth event for our community. And so much as if you take advantage of it, a lot of good things will happen, tax wise, infrastructure wise, and what it means to our community. And so I see it from that perspective. And I would think that from an economic development perspective, the jobs it helps create and the other jobs that ripple from it, because companies now have that access closer and easier, and which is more affordable. And, there's a lot of good reasons for this to happen, I think. But I think if maybe the most persuasive thing I could say is if you do think we're in an information economy and you think 10 years from now, I don't think there'll be any regrets.
Right. And you can look at it as everything pivots. And I'm sorry, we're coming up on a break. We'll be right back and we'll finish that comment. And we're back beyond the blueprint. And we were working on the topic of what this impact means. And, if we go back to, we mentioned, some other things, motorsports and change and technology earlier. Think back to all the industries that came out of the motorsports industry being in Mooresville. I mean, now our shift into high tech, into high tech manufacturing and other things with the engineering skill sets that motorsports brought us. Now, as we continue to move into a digital technology, a digital age, what are the other jobs that will be created in the future that we can't even imagine today? So it's the future job creation, and then also the ad valorem tax. I think I read a number that it was close to $6 billion just in the real estate side of it, the property. So that's a big number to Iredell County and to the town of Mooresville that really needs to be considered.
Yeah, absolutely. Number one, you look at when you bring in such a big project like that, what happens is that your property tax goes down. I mean, it's going to be, when you bring in that big of a entity that's got that type of impact, it helps the, the widow living on a fixed income where, there's so many things that we have to pay for and have to do when you have such a large taxpayer comes in. I mean, I just like, you want to move, can I have it in my backyard? I mean, it's
Right.
it is like striking oil. Plus you think about all the other services from in the county and the state where the teachers will benefit from it because you have that more money coming in. The fire departments will benefit, police department, where, the sheriffs, the first responders. It is such an impact that when you have a huge win-win operation coming in this way, it really, really benefits everyone. And, it doesn't matter from what walk of life, what socioeconomic level you're in, when you have a project like this, you benefit. I think of watching plants close down. I mean, I've been to, working on that as with the Department of Commerce. I did for 4.5 years, working with employment law, unemployed, that when you see a game changer come in like this, the whole economy changes. And it's so beneficial to so many people that, you're talking about the jobs that come in, the jobs that, bring in money. One example I think about being in the area that this happened, that a former, person that worked at a plant maybe didn't have that education skill set. Mm-hmm. He started a mobile car washing unit. Mm-hmm. And honestly, when he told me his revenue stream, I'm like, hey, give me a rag. I'll help you wash cars. I mean, the guy, this was back in the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. He was bringing in over $100,000 a year because he went from assistant foreman at a plant that closed down to a mobile car washing unit And I mean, he was making close to $100,000 a year, and that was in 2002.
Wow.
So, I mean, rising tide lifts all boats. This is a rising tide.
It's a rising tide for that, but it's also, it's not high impact on job creation, but it pays a lot of bills. It pays a lot of tax.
It certainly does that, but it actually has an indirect. You were mentioning this before, and I think it is important to remember there is direct benefits, which is the investment itself and the employees that work there and things, but there's also a lot of indirect benefits of these things. And it's bigger than you would expect, I think, normally, because providing this infrastructure helps a lot of people. It reminds me of the stories of like, how did Holiday Inn come to be? Well, it's because we had highways and people needed a place to rest off the highway. Mm-hmm. That was an indirect impact of what they thought was, that was not why they built the highways, but it was a hugely benefit to people who needed a place to stay to have something called a Holiday Inn along the way. So it's just sort of interesting. And I think those kinds of benefits are often accrued to infrastructure development just across the board, whether you're looking at clean water or cheap electricity or, digital infrastructure so people can, begin to like ride this trend and to make sure that we're on top of it and that our kids are well educated and understand it, because it's going to continue to change and morph at a speed that is pretty breathtaking, I think. And so having the infrastructure to make sure that we're on top of that is quite handy. And I don't know, how many schools could you build for $120 million or $60 million or
that's paid in perpetuity, right? So it's not something that comes and goes every year. I mean, it's here for the long run.
Yeah, I mean, it is such a fantastic project. And here's one thing that a lot of people, and when you said Chuck Yeager, I mentioned Chuck Yeager, thinking about what he did to break the sound.
We were just happy you did.
Yeah. and I mean, he flew it with broken ribs. Yeah, he broke the sound barrier with broken ribs. And what he did, getting on a piece of equipment with the government, lowest bid contractor. Rockets that people have died doing. And, he was willing to push that forward. And part of it was the adventure, but also duty to country. And one thing, if we don't do this as a country, if we don't stay, it's like we are going to stay ahead on the energy, production. We're not going to stay ahead on AI and computer. We're falling behind. And we don't want to do that as a country. We don't want to become a second tier country because we aren't forward thinking and looking at how do we have our data centers that can produce, because if we fall behind, then we fall behind as a country. So, part of this is national defense issue. It really is. Mm-hmm. If we don't have the power, if we don't have the AI, if we don't have the data centers, then they'll go somewhere else. And I had this, a good example of what our competition is with China. I like to watch news in other countries. And it was kind of one of my favorite episodes, even though it was very telling, was news out of South Korea. Mm-hmm. Everything they had was canceled that day because of the pollution that came from the coal plants in China. Couldn't do a ribbon cutting that day because the smog was so terrible coming from China. All sports were canceled because of the smog from China. And the entire episode of news, it was a local news out of South Korea, that I'm like, that's our competition. They don't have the environmental regulations, and some of the regulations do hinder us that we have. But how do we think through those regulations? Like, that regulation has been on the books for over 40 years. Is it really valuable? Is it really working? And, we don't need to keep up at the speed of government, which is working an 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. We need to look at how do we make government work for us 24 hours a day? How do we bridge that gap where we're working all the time to be better? And to me, it's a national security issue. It's a national economic issue. And that's where we need to say, hey, what are we going to do for the cause? What are we going to do for this country to make sure that we're still the provider for jobs and economy and democracy in this world? Or are we going to take a second seat to China and that totalitarian government that doesn't care about human rights?
What are your thoughts? You have a specific tie into that.
Yeah, well, we lived in Korea for 5 years. I
didn't know.
I was actually for a short while president of General Motors Korea for about 2.5 years or so. But we were there twice and came to love the place actually. But It is proximate to China, as you say, and this conversation of some of these things has come up recently, and we have it fairly often. It's discussed, the idea of rare earths and critical minerals, which are not the same thing, by the way. But these issues affect, our ability to compete and our defense posture. Do we have the metals we need to be able to build a jet engine, for example, at the price point that doesn't make it hard to do or impossible to do, more likely. And so, these are very real issues, and they often turn on accepted sort of dogma, in a sense, on like environmental rules and things of this sort. Now, clearly, it's a big decision to say I'm going to have an open pit mine near my house. We have to think carefully about this. And if we are going to protect our population, and the Chinese have a lower threshold on that, clearly, you give up some industries. And did we do that eyes wide open? Would we do it again now? It's hard to say, but these are very real discussions, and I think complex, and why I think it's quite important. We have very good elected officials. We vote carefully. And I think it's also important, like we said, we collaborate together to work to try to get through some of these complex issues. It's difficult. But I do think, when you look at, partners like Korea and things, their development has been breathtaking, and really quite beneficial to us in the United States as a partner, and we're trying to deal with that. But they made a lot of changes in their economy too, just like we have, that I think, as we look at some of these things and how do we address, because I don't have anything particularly personal against China. I don't think any of us do, but their system is not one that I would encourage us to adopt. And I certainly don't want them to ask us to adopt theirs either. So there are some things that are at stake here, and how we think about them and how our decision-making processes, they make a difference. And so I'm cautiously optimistic about the future, but we do have challenges.
We do. And we have challenges locally and abroad. But we're going to wrap up here, and I'll leave you one last comment on technology and embracing it in the region. And we have 30 seconds each, and we'll go for next week.
I think we're at a crossroads, and that's Iredell County's crossroads for the future. And which way do we go? Do we go to energy and technology and innovation, or do we try to hold back and say, well, we're happy with where we are? Do you want to be the leader, or do you want to be in the second row or third row behind? And it's, the theory of the sled dog. Do you want to be in the front or be in the back?
Iredell first.
Yeah. Yes, I have no question. I would say maybe one thing that I think is that the change coming at people is fast and furious. And I think it's understandable that it was caused concern. One of them that we talk about, for example, is AI, which in my mind is neither artificial or intelligent per se. It's designing computers to act like human beings. That's what it is. And we do large language models. We have neural nets. There's different techniques for this. And are we at a point where computers reason on their own? Hard to say. We don't know. We don't think so. Maybe a little here and there, but this is not a threat per se. If you choose to understand it, get informed, and try to make sure that you are engaged in conversations that matter on these things, like anything that's important. And I would say that there's lots of organizations that care about doing this well, but be involved. Let's collaborate, work together, and try to get the best outcomes, not leave it to the worst because we don't care, or we think it's too complex. These are not luxuries you have.
No, they're not. And we're going to leave on that. Thank you, guys. Thank you, David. Thank you, Andrew, Senator, Your Excellency, Brock, for joining us. And we will see you again next week on Beyond the Blueprint.